everybody. Welcome to this episode of Talking Tendons. It is a special episode. I'm going to be talking today about isometric exercise interventions, where their place is in regards to tendinopathy rehabilitation specifically. And there was lots of interest over the last week. And the motivation for this episode of Talking Tendons is a editorial that was published in British Journal of Sports Medicine. Lead author Karen Silbernagel, second author Bill Vizencino, third author Michael Rathleff, and last author Christian Thorberg. So it was the title of the editorial is Isometric Exercise for Acute Pain Relief. Is it relevant in tendinopathy management? So this is the first thing that I want to focus your attention to. This really is talking about isometric exercise for acute management of pain. Okay, they're not talking about isometric exercise for anything else in this regard than acute management of pain. And I thought the editorial was really timely and very well written, and also poses some questions that I think as scientists we need to address. So the first question, and this is how they've set out the editorial, there's three questions. There is, what is the strength of the evidence for adopting isometrics for tendinopathy? And again, this is about isometrics for acute pain. Question two, is it beneficial to achieve acute pain relief in individuals with long-standing pain? And then the third question is, has isometrics proven superior in tendinopathy management? Okay, so these are very, very, very important scientific questions. And I think this is why, as a clinician, I work at Monash University 4 days a week. I also work as a clinician in private practice 1 day a week, and I see mainly tendon patients on that day. I also do some teaching, i.e. tendinopathy course teaching, and I'm going to do a shameless plug here. I've got a course series coming up in the UK. I was going to do it at the start, then I forgot, so I'll do it now. And that is, I think I'm going to be over there in about a month. It's starting, or just over a month, and I've got a few dates all over the UK. Have a look at the tendinopathy.rehab.com website if you're interested in living in the UK. So basically, my frustration as a clinician is that people, clinicians particularly, because we're so starved of evidence, we tend to pick up any evidence we can and run with it and apply it, where really we should be asking more questions like the questions that are in this editorial. And we need to understand more about interventions, their efficacy, when they should be used before we apply them. That's not to say we need robust evidence for everything before we use it, but we need to appreciate where it fits in the landscape of evidence, because the problem is, and this is a big problem in my opinion, people have taken the isometric evidence and they're doing it for everything. So some clinicians will use isometrics for everything and for extended periods of time, and that's not how the authors of the original Ebony Rio study intended it. That's not how they use it. The group that has sort of started this isometric, should we call it a revolution? But this is what happens. The clinicians will take it and they'll run with it because they have an impression that perhaps it is better than other things, and it's going to be more effective, and people then start to think, oh, this is what we do for tendinopathy, okay. And it's partly the fault of, fault is not a good word, but I mean it's understanding the evidence from the point of view of the research community and clinicians. I don't think it's just clinicians or the research community, and having very clear messages about where the evidence is and the uncertainty that we have, and whether we should be adopting something over and above other things. So this is basically what I'm pretty sure this is what this editorial was trying to address, and that is the question of, okay, so we are in a phase of really having adopted isometric exercise, which is really an amazing translational step. They say evidence takes 17 years to translate into clinical practice. That certainly is not always the case when you look at things like isometrics. And, we can also say the same thing for eccentrics, and that was, back in the 90s when the people were adopting that as the best way of doing things and only using that. Now, the questions in this editorial really drill down to the current evidence and the state of the evidence. When you look at the first paper, so let's do a little bit of a walkthrough of the evidence where we've come from. So the initial paper, and they talk about it, by Dr. Ebony Rio and colleagues, they looked at 6 people in a crossover study, and they basically looked at people from a point of view of, they used TMS to look at motor cortex measures, so inhibition and corticospinal excitability. They also looked at and related that to they looked at changes in pain pre and post loading intervention, which was isometrics or isotonic, and they found very good effects from short-term pain for isotonics, and the good effect was that pretty much everyone had a resolution of their symptoms. The main point in terms of strength of evidence is that if you are going to be confident or certain is the word we use in research about a finding or about an intervention, then we need studies to be able to replicate that finding. Otherwise, we are not so certain that what we're seeing in one study is actually repeatable or something that we can say is a real phenomenon. And this is what we haven't got, and this is one of the points of the editorial. So there are multiple groups, and they talk about Seth O'Neill, they talk about Brooke Coombs has done a isometric study. There are multiple isometric studies from the Achilles to the elbow, even recently in the plantar fascia, and none of them have been able to replicate the findings. Now, what I mean by not being able to replicate the findings is that some people get better with isometrics, that's for sure. Some people don't get better in terms of acute pain, and you usually measure it from a loading test. So some sort of loading test. So in the Achilles, you might do a hop or a calf raise. A hop is a terrible loading test, or a difficult, I should say, loading test to do, because people may hop in a reduced or different manner the second time you measure them. Something like patellar tendon is easier because you've got the single leg decline squat, which is quite standardizable. So it's a bit easier to then measure over time if people are changing. I remember in the Brooke Coombs study, they used a brilliant MVC rig. So they looked at the same amount of torque, and that was very reproducible. It was related to the amount of pain people had. So one of the, I guess you could say, criticisms of some of the Achilles work is that hopping pain, it's not such a good outcome as a load test. But, there are other outcomes that were used in the Seth O'Neill study. But the point is that when you look at the overall evidence, that people have variable response to isometric exercise in terms of acute changes in pain, usually on load tests. It's not a consistent finding that everyone gets better and basically has a great outcome and, feels a lot better after isometrics. And that is what happened in the original Ebony Rio study. Now, that could be for many reasons. It could be that there was bias in the study. It could be that there was a certain selection of individuals, and that meant that they were responders. That could have been through their selection process. It could have been through luck. It's difficult to say, but you're picking people, and the selection of people probably has something to do with it. So Ebony Rio and colleagues would argue that, and I've heard heard them argue this, and that is that there is a selection issue, and maybe some of the other studies are not selecting people effectively or the right people. That may be true. But what's also true is that based on an N equals 6 and the fact that there's so much disparity in the rest of the literature, we really don't have any certainty about the effect of isometrics on short-term tendon pain. And that's the fact of the matter. Regardless of the differences between studies, how they were done, contraction time, position of isometrics, etc., etc., we've got one study that shows it's better than sliced bread, and the other studies show there's diversity and disparity in people's responses. So we don't have strong evidence. So this is the caution. Let's think about loading people. Let's recognise that loading probably is beneficial if applied at the right time, in the right way. What is the right way? Well, we don't know. Try different things. There is an argument for trying isometrics, and potentially isometrics is going to be less painful for some people that have a lot of pain with isotonics. And there's an example of selecting your participants. You've selected people who haven't responded to isotonics, and now you're putting them in isometrics, and maybe you'll find a joint range where they can load with less pain, and they have a better pain response. So I think what we need to do, and this is put very well in the editorial, is that we need to be happy that, confident, certain that load is probably beneficial for tendinopathy. The type of load isn't very clear for different stages, for different people. We haven't got a good selection. It's a no-brainer to say if isometrics is more tolerable, maybe that's a good place to start. That's about as certain as we can be, or as clear as we can be. We don't have good evidence that isometrics is better. There is one prospective study where they looked at 20 athletes, isometrics versus isotonic during a season, and there wasn't clear differences between the groups. So we can't say isometrics are better for in-season athletes based on the current evidence. We can argue that they are because they maybe they're less fatiguing, but based on the current evidence, we can't even say that. So there is, I guess, there is huge uncertainty. My group is starting to look at trying to understand the mechanisms by which people start to have responses, good or bad, to pain in the short term. There are so many factors. There are cognitive factors. There are pain factors. There may be pathology-related factors, and that is again coming down to diagnosis that is clear and certain. Pain presentation. There are so many factors that might influence people's response in the short term to pain. But I think it's an important question, and as scientists, we need to then understand where this seeming sort of variability in response is coming from, what factors are driving it. I think that's very important. But the other thing to say is that I don't want to take anything away from Ebony Rio and their group. Their study of N equals 6 was a really good initial look at some of the mechanisms with isometrics, and it's obviously been hugely influential and sparked a lot of interest, and that can't be taken away. What I guess is being disputed with the editorial is how we can apply this evidence in a clinical context, and potentially the misapplication of this evidence, and that probably stems from clinical biases and views. People have strong views that isometrics are really, really helpful, and they're helpful for diagnosis, and we don't have, and they're better for in-season athletes. currently we don't have the evidence to support that. We can make arguments, but we don't have the evidence to support that currently. And the in-season argument is, I feel, quite a good one, because you have less, potentially less fatigue, which is important in that in-season environment. But the clinical argument, I think, is not so good, and that is that if it's a tendon, it will respond to isometrics. I think we don't necessarily know that other pathologies won't respond and a tendon will. And again, it's the mechanisms that we need to understand to start to answer that question. So I think the in-season, the clinical, the rehab argument, when you've got a rehab person in your clinic, just load them with isotonics. See if that helps. If it doesn't help, load them with isometrics. See if that helps. Maybe you can do a combination of both. I often do in clinical practice combinations of isometric, isotonic, sometimes even eccentric. And it just depends on what you can do to maximize your goals that might be related to muscle activation, strength, pain, tendon adaptation. So you've got to think about what can you do to try and achieve your goals. And it's, it really is led by what we know. And that brings me on to the last thing that I wanted to discuss in this brief podcast, and that is, going beyond acute pain effects of isometrics. There are many other effects that are quite useful. And as I say, I use isometrics a lot in clinical practice. Isometrics are very well controlled, very well tolerated, both from a fatigue and pain point of view, if you find the right position. You can pick points in range that an individual is having difficulty with and get them stronger in that point, or get them more load tolerant in that point. So it allows you to be, one of the arguments against isometrics is a specificity of strength gains at that angle, but that's perfect if you want to strengthen at a specific angle. So, or if you want load tolerance at a specific angle, work around that angle. So this is where isometrics can be so beneficial. For example, you've got people that have got a partial tear, or I shouldn't say partial tear, because that's a very contentious phrase, but someone who's got proper calf dysfunction where they can't even do a calf raise, or they can do a calf raise but they're really struggling to get inner range, which often happens after rupture or after proper partial rupture, then you need to potentially pick points in the range that are weak to strengthen. And isometrics is a perfect way to do that. So isometrics can be so useful for other reasons aside from short-term pain. Isometrics, if you do them in a long length, you'll get benefits. They are more likely to relate to you're more likely to get strength gains, because at a longer length you're going to have greater muscle tendon unit load. So you'll get more of a response. The other advantage of let me explain that point a bit more. So if you're loading for concentric, eccentric for a total time under tension of 90 seconds, and then you do a long length isometric for the same amount of time, you may get more load in the actual system overall with a long length isometric. So that's another way to then speed up your muscle tendon adaptation. Tendons love isometric for adaptation, and I've been talking about this for years. This is how I started isometrics before they became popular for pain, and I still use them for this, and that is for maximizing, well, not maximizing, but in a controlled way, delivering high strain to a tendon. And we're doing experiments currently on this where we're looking at adaptation potential with controlled levels, with controlled isometric protocols. And another potential use of isometrics is sort of what you might call explosive or fast intent isometrics. So some people would use them and really push quickly, so rate of force development goes way up, and potentially that increases, and then you can sustain them, so you still get a good sustained load on the tendon, because remember, tendon is very mechano-responsive tissue, and it adapts to two things. One is it's only one thing really. It's high strain. High strain is the most is the biggest determinant of adaptation. The only thing is it needs to be sustained for a long period of time. So it has to be high strain sustained for periods of time. So if you do fast intent isometrics, but you don't hold them for very long, you're still getting high strain, but you also might get increases in rate of force development. So it might be a way of increasing rate of force development early on in a tendon patient in a way that is safer than, say, doing a concentric quick effort, which may take them into ranges that are less comfortable. So there are huge benefits of isometrics beyond what we are all focused on at the moment, and that is looking at the response to load. The pain response. So I just wanted to talk about that. It was a really interesting podcast. I would link it to the show notes. It's only a page. Please read it. Don't take my word for it. Have a read. Really, really well-timed editorial by Karen Silbernagel, Bill Vizencino, Michael Rathleff, and Christian Thorberg. So well done. But also, as I said, well done to everyone else who's done isometric studies, because it is improving things in our own incremental way. It's not about, I believe it's not about arguing about things. It's about understanding the evidence, the limitations and the uncertainties, and then addressing those as clinicians, but also as researchers. And that's how we'll improve patient care, which really is the main goal. Improving patient care, not sticking with what we think works. The argument that, this works because we know it works clinically just does not stand up. Anything works clinically. Anything you do to a patient will potentially work if they think they're having something done to them. We all know that. There's unspecific effects in everything we do, and they're huge. And exercise has huge non-specific effects. The story I always, or the evidence I always cite when people ask me about this in courses is, what about, surely exercise has lots of specific effects and benefits, and yes, it does. But if you really look at the evidence, and the shoulder is there's a shoulder RCT as well as a gluteal tendinopathy RCT looking at exercise versus sham for tendinopathy, and they both show that exercise is no better than sham when you compare it to sham. So I believe the most fundamental initial question is to determine if there are effects over placebo, because if there aren't, even if the patient's getting better, I think we deserve to know that most of these effects are non-specific. But anyway, that is probably a conversation for another podcast. So thank you very much for listening. As I say, I'll link the editorial to the show notes, and I'll see you next time.